Yeah.
Making sure everybody.
All right, doing a quick sound check since we're wearing masks. Can folks behind the podium hear us? Okay, thank you. As see the speakers for the petitioner, is there someone already here for Charlotte Pipe and Foundry? Thank you. And is Kathy Buckley? Thank you. And is Rihanna Ashley here? Thank you. We're just missing a couple commissioners. Let's give them maybe 2 more minutes to get here, then we'll get started. Commissioner Bailey, are you on the line? Commissioner Bailey?
I'm here.
Okay, great, thank you. Commissioner Davis?
I'm here.
Thank you. Commissioner Lazarus? Item 2, I'm going to call this meeting of the Air Quality Committee to order. General Statute 138A-15 mandates that the chair inquire as to whether any member knows of any known conflict of interest or appearance of conflict with respect to matters before the commission. If any member knows of a conflict of interest or appearance of conflict, would please so state at this time. Hearing none. Over a couple of housekeeping items, as this is the first time we're all back in about 15, 16 months together, and we're wearing masks for the first time. So I'm going to ask everyone to speak extra loud into your microphone and help your neighbor to remember to pull the mic down basically right in front of your mouth and speak very loudly into it so everyone can hear it, including the commissioners who are joining us remotely today. Second, we're going to hear from a few speakers today. I'm going to ask the members of the committee and the other commission members to hold their questions till after their presentation so we can move through as efficiently as possible. And one other item is I'm going to go through the rule when it comes to asking questions. I'm going to go through the committee first alphabetically and then to the other commissioners who are joining us today so everyone has a chance to speak. And with that, I'll turn it over to Council Reynolds for a few instructional statements for us today.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You had asked me at the beginning to discuss with the members what the purpose of the meeting was or is, what a vote today would mean, and in general, what that means about rulemaking. So as you're well aware, the commission is here to consider a petition for rulemaking submitted by SCLC on behalf of its clients regarding the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. This is still a quasi-legislative decision because it involves rulemaking. And so it will be up to your discretion to determine the policy question of whether we'd like to pursue that or not. There are authority questions that we've held and discussed before. But I'd like to back up and start with what a petition for rulemaking is. A petition for rulemaking is a request that an agency begin the rulemaking process as it would with a specific set of rules as it would with any other rule. Of course, it said that the granting of a petition is just that. You grant a petition. It does not mean that you are bound to adopt the rule at the end of that process, only that you begin the rulemaking process itself, which is governed by the Administrative Procedure Act. And you are all well aware now of what it takes to do rulemaking, do fiscal notes, et cetera, public notice and comment, those types of things. So for the committee's purposes, today you are deciding whether to recommend to the commission whether it should or it should not grant the petition. Your decision today is not final, and irrespective of which way you decide, the commission will still nonetheless have the responsibility in protecting final action on the petition only. So again, I just want to emphasize that a vote to recommend is not a vote to do final adoption. It's just, as I like to say, a vote to recommend that we continue the conversation and the discussion through the rulemaking process, and whatever that process dictates is what would control these rules. So the statute controlling petitions for rulemaking is 150B-20, and what it says is that where a petitioner petitions an agency to engage in rulemaking, and it requires for instance here, the adoption of rules not previously there, then they have to submit the text as well. So that's what you're voting on, is the text of the rule, and moving forward with that. Or that's the basis for your decision on the petition. With that, Madam Chair, I'm glad to answer any questions you might have.
Any questions from the committee? Any questions from other commissioners? Commissioner Bailey, any questions? Commissioner Bailey?
No.
And Commissioner Davis?
No.
We'll move on just so the speakers know what order they'll be speaking in. First up is the speakers for the petitioner at 15 minutes. Following that is the speaker for Charlotte Pipe and Foundry, who also has 15 minutes. I'll be keeping time, and I'll give you a warning when we're getting close to the end. And then we have our other speakers. First up would be Leanna Ashley and Kathy Buckley, each with 3 minutes apiece. So speakers for our petitioners, please come up. And please remember to speak loudly into that microphone.
Chair Arata, members of the commission, first, welcome back. It's been a long 14 to 16 months. I'm Dirk Carter with the Southern Environmental Law Center on behalf of petitioners. I have with me today Nick Jimenez, who will assist with the presentation, my other colleague, Gudrun Thompson, and also Franz Litz, who's been involved with the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative since its inception, most recently advising Virginia DEQ in constructing their program to join RGGI. I'm going to address the reasons for the petition. I'll then turn it over to Mr. Jimenez, who will detail the rule, and I'll conclude with a summary of your authorities to adopt and implement the rule. The threat to North Carolina from climate change is real. Sea levels have risen and continue to rise, affecting low-lying coastal areas. Extreme precipitation events are becoming more frequent. The number and intensity of hurricanes is increasing, and we've experienced an unprecedented number of flooding events in recent years. We've attached to the petition a detailed summary of how climate change is affecting the economy, the natural resources, and the people of North Carolina, and it is only going to get worse. Scientists are telling us that we need to hold global temperature increase to no more than 1.5 degrees centigrade by mid-century, or 2050, to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. We need to achieve that goal, we need to reach carbon neutrality by mid-century or 2050. But also important is this decade, reducing carbon emissions substantially during this decade if we're going to have a chance to meet any of these goals. So the target year is 2030, which is only 8.5 years away. Through the Paris Accord and nation-specific action, most of the world is coalescing around these goals and objectives. We need to reduce carbon emissions by 70% from 2005 levels by the year 2030 and reach carbon neutrality by 2050. Every nation and every state that is a contributor to this problem has a role and a responsibility to reduce carbon emissions. We applaud Governor Cooper for taking leadership in North Carolina on our state meeting its responsibilities. He issued Executive Order 80 in October 2018. The executive order set an immediate goal of reducing carbon emissions by 40% from 2005 levels by 2025. He also directed the preparation of a clean energy plan. DEQ prepared the Clean Energy Plan, which it issued in October of 2019. Among its many recommendations, the first recommendation, A1, is to decarbonize the electric power sector. It sets a goal to reduce carbon emissions from the electric power sector by 70% by 2030, reaching carbon neutrality by 2050, as set forth here. The good news is, because of some previous actions North Carolina has taken, we're actually on the way, almost halfway to meeting that 70% reduction. Current estimates are we've reduced carbon emissions by 48.4 million metric tons. This has resulted from the Clean Smokestacks program, which has had the incidental effect of reducing carbon emissions, which, by the way, was a declining cap on SO2 and NOx emissions. Also, actions by the legislature in implementing clean energy renewable portfolio standard requirements. This plan initiated a process that became known as the A1 process, resulting in another report, the A1 report. And I know you've been given a presentation on this A1 report. It evaluated numerous ways and combinations of ways to meet these carbon reduction goals. It evaluates the policy options. It has extensive modeling of the results that can be achieved and the costs associated with them. It provides information to inform decisions, but does not make a recommendations. One of the options recommended is joining the regional effort, or RGGI, that now includes Virginia and essentially all the states to our north. So there's a lot in that report. I know you've been given a presentation previously of the information that's contained in this report. It was prepared with the assistance of UNC and Duke. A lot went into this. Numerous stakeholders were involved. And I'll point you to what we think are compelling conclusions that we anticipated from our work in Virginia on the RGGI program that prompted us to try to expedite the process of getting North Carolina on a path to incorporating RGGI as a strategy. RGGI, this is the quote from the report. This is all the data over here that you can examine and we can talk about, but the basic conclusion is RGGI policies drive some of the deepest in-state reductions by 2030, with RGGI providing the quickest reductions prior to 2030. RGGI strategies, this cap and declining cap, push carbon-intensive sources off the energy production, power generation sector. Clean energy standards can play an important role by pulling them in, but they don't push the carbon out as effectively and efficiently as RGGI. So one of the other compelling conclusions from the report is that RGGI costs, either as a change in net present value or cost per ton reduced, are among the lowest of the options recommended. So you've got an approach that can push carbon out, achieve the reductions, while at the same time moderating the costs associated with achieving those reductions. So I'm going to turn this over to Mr. Jimenez now, who's going to talk about how this program and this rule would work.
Thanks, Derb. Commissioners, thanks for having us. I think we wanted, kind of in the line of what Derb was just talking about, we wanted to put this up just to show some of the projected benefits. Joining the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. So one of the good things about setting a deadline for action on this A1 report is that we have a pretty good idea of what it's going to do. These are some of the top line items. Very quick reduction in CO2 emissions, which has a really important impact on cumulative emissions reductions. Now that's at the end of the day what the atmosphere cares about is, or what affects the atmosphere is how much is up there. That comes from reducing fossil fuel generation, reduction in criteria pollutants, traditional kind of co-pollutants that we worry about, track those reductions. We build about half as much new gas between now and 2030, and it's very cost effective, as Derb mentioned. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about the proposed rule itself, kind of a big picture of what it does, where it comes from. We based it on the RGGI model rule. That's a sort of template that the RGGI states have developed that they all use themselves with some minor state deviations. We've made a couple of those too that I'll cover at the end. It covers electric power generation greater than 25 megawatts, sets a declining statewide budget out to 2030. And of course, we participate in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, RGGI. So what is RGGI? It's a common auction. These are the states and kind of where they are in the process right now. The idea is each state sets its own budget for its own carbon emissions from the power sector using state law. Those budgets then become allowances. So one allowance is worth 1 ton of emissions. Everyone puts those allowances together into a pool, and then emitters of carbon in all of the different states can buy from that common pool at auction. It's a quarterly auction. And then there are also, they call it a secondary market, where there's trading allowed among emitters if they have a few extra or need a few more outside of those quarterly auctions. So here's just a very simple representation of the budget we proposed. The year along the bottom turned kind of biblical on me. So really that's for 2022 to 2030. It's a linear decline from about actual emissions down to the Clean Energy Plan goal, 70% below 2005 by 2030. So here's kind of a quick visual representation of this turning into allowances. That's year 2022. There are all the allowances there. Every state does that. You got all the allowances. They put them together in this pool for the auction. All of the emitters, you can see the little smokestacks with their dollars, send them in, and then they get the allowances back. So if you're an emitter, what do you do? This is essentially it. You've got, for every ton, you've got to have an allowance to cover it. You turn those in every 3 years. That's what they call a compliance period. And then in each of the first 2 years of that period, you've got to be holding on to at least half as many of the allowances as you need to cover your emissions. So another kind of big feature that I want to make sure to cover is the consignment auction structure that we proposed for the rule. I like to think of it like a consignment shop. You own something, you put it there, they sell it, and then the money comes back to you. That's kind of what's going on. So I talked about the budget, and the state budget becomes the allowances. DEQ takes those allowances, gives them to emitters as conditional allowances. That condition is they can't turn around and use those for compliance. They can't just say, okay, here you go back to cover the emissions. They can sell them into RGGI. They don't legally have to, but that's available. Don't see why they wouldn't. So that's them selling into RGGI. The money comes back to the emitters. I added the Utilities Commission there because for the regulated utilities in the state, the Utilities Commission is going to have a kind of decide how to handle that revenue. And then the fourth step is any emitter, that could be the same emitter, could be somebody in another state, buys the allowances from the auction. Once they've gone through the auction, they can be used for compliance. So I said I'd cover the key differences from the model rule. These are the ones I've covered the top two, kind of the cap that we used that's based on the Clean Energy Plan goal. Consignment option structure, we just talked about. We did not provide for offsets in North Carolina. The model rule allows certain types of offsets to be created in a state to cover emissions. Those are landfill methane capture, certain forestry practices, and agricultural methane capture. And those just really haven't played much of a role in the way RGGI works. There's been one project so far, landfill methane in Maryland, and we're aware of, we have a number of concerns about offsets ourselves. So given that they're not playing an important part, we just did not think that was important at this stage. They could always be added on later after more conversation. We covered everything. That doesn't really mean everything. That doesn't mean cars or something. That's still power generation over 25 megawatts. So everything that emits carbon is what I'm trying to say there, not just fossil fuel burning facilities. No free passes on emitting carbon. We did not treat biomass as carbon neutral. The model rule has a provision that essentially says if you're burning biomass, you can kind of discount the carbon that comes from that. That's not right. It's not carbon neutral. We did not exempt industrial emitters. So the model rule says if you're in an industrial facility, you've got a power plant on site, and you amend your Clean Air Act permit so that you can't export more than 10%, you're not covered by the program. We didn't include that for a number of reasons, largely to get the carbon under control. And we included a provision that for a program review, just to make sure that the program is working well, we can identify any issues that come up. And so I think I'll pass it back to Derb to talk about authority. Thank you.
And finally, I'm going to just provide an overview of your authority to adopt the rules as proposed. And I'm going to begin, some of this may be familiar with you, but I'm going to begin with just the declarations of public policy that are in the Air Quality Act. And these are important because you'll see when I get to your specific authority, they refer back to achieving these legislative objectives. And obviously the first one is to provide for the conservation of air resources in the state, to achieve and maintain for the citizens of the state a total environment of superior quality, and to allow for the use of our air resources in the best interest of all of our citizens.
Sorry, Mr. Carter, would you mind speaking louder? We're hearing that it's hard to hear you on the mic.
Sure.
And you are approaching 15 minutes, so if you can wrap up another 2 to 3, that would be great.
Great, thank you. This is important because it's a direction to administer a complete program of air conservation. And this is very noteworthy. The legislature says it wants you to achieve a coordinated effort of pollution and abatement with other jurisdictions or states. I'm going to skip that one. Definitions. Air contaminants include gas. Carbon dioxide is a gas. Air contaminants in excessive quantities, carbon dioxide is an air contaminant. Air pollution is the presence of an air contaminant in the atmosphere that tends to be injurious to public health or welfare. Carbon dioxide in excessive levels constitute air pollution under North Carolina law. And standard is a measure or measure of the quality of air. Now, your duties, not your authority, just your authority, but actually your duties from the legislature are to develop air quality standards as the commission deems appropriate in order to promote the policies and purposes of the act that I just summarized. And a cap on carbon emissions is an air quality standard that meets the definition of standard under the act. You're also required to develop emission control standards, as in the judgment of the commission may be necessary to abate air pollution. And here, implementation of this declining cap program is commensurate with meeting this goal and objective that's set for carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that particularly recognizes carbon dioxide as a global pollutant. And the approach that's being taken has actually been acknowledged by the legislature, which in a provision that allows for the voluntary early reduction of pollution explicitly says emissions banking and trading is an approach that can be utilized under the law. So thank you very much, Chair Arata. The urgency of this is what prompted us to try to pull this together and file this petition. As Commissioner or as Council Reynolds noted, and as I know you are aware, rulemaking has become a very protracted process in North Carolina. We need to get this underway if the state's going to play a meaningful role in meeting these carbon reduction targets, and we hope you share our concerns and also share our interest in promptly initiating this process. And we respectfully request that you approve the petition rule and move it on to the full commission. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm going to start with the committee going around alphabetically. So warning to Commissioner Bailey, please turn yourself off mute. You're up first. Commissioner Bailey, any questions?
No, thank you.
Commissioner Carter.
Yes. So I can speak. A couple of clarifications, and I suspect I probably need to talk to the second speaker. I'm curious about a couple of, or at least one specific thing here in the allowance allocations. I'm looking at for 2022, it's 38,654,000. That's what is that calculated off of? What are the current electric power sector CO2 emissions on an annual basis?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Sorry, we based that on the state greenhouse gas inventory from 2019. So, the actual emissions tend to change over time, and you can kind of just do your best based on a projection. We've seen a pretty unexpected change in emissions due to COVID. The intent is to start with actual emissions, and we actually included a provision that would adjust the emissions depending on when the rule is final.
Okay, but I'm just trying to get an idea. So what is the current emissions level? Is it 40 million tons rather than the 38 plus that you're projecting here for the?
It's about that for in-state emissions.
Okay. And let me see if I'm doing the math right here. Based on that and looking at let's page 7 of the petition. The trigger price, the CO2 CCR trigger price for 2022 is $13.91.
That sounds right.
That's a per ton.
Yes, sir.
Price. So I did just a quick math. I was curious to see what this looked like now. So based on 38,651,000 tons and this trigger price of $13.91, you're talking about a revenue amount of 500, as I get it here, nearly $538 million. You mentioned on one of your slides, commission dealing with obviously rates is an issue and how this can be treated, but also revenue. But I guess I'm not clear who that revenue is actually going to achieve this revenue we're talking here. It's 538 million. Whose pocket does that go into?
So just a clarification, Commissioner, you're quoting the cost containment reserve price. So that's not kind of what we expect the price to actually be. The price has never gone over $8 so far. I think that's where it was at the most recent auction of less than a week ago.
Okay.
So we can talk about what the cost containment reserve is.
Well, that's fine. No, I don't really want to get into that. I guess I didn't understand that distinction. But even so, all right, even at $8 a ton, we're still talking about just off the top of my head, something around $400 million.
Yeah,
a pretty hefty sum that we're proposing here. So back to my question: who pockets that revenue when it comes in when these allowances are purchased?
I wouldn't phrase it as pocketing, Commissioner, but it goes back to the emitters. So if you whoever owns a facility that is covered by the rule. And they also have to buy the allowances that they need to cover their emissions. So in the case, for the vast majority of the emitting generation in the state is owned by the regulated utilities. So we come back to them, and then the commission kind of oversees how they handle costs for environmental compliance and revenue that would come in.
Well, okay, I guess I'm a little confused because I thought you said, and I thought I understood this to be the case that unlike the Title IV allowance system under the Federal Clean Air Act, where facilities simply receive an allocation of allowances, I thought I understood that each affected facility was going to have to purchase those up front. Okay. So they're going to have an outlay. Somebody's going to have an outlay of about $400 million, the bulk of which is probably with regulated utilities.
That's right.
Right. But the only way they would then achieve revenue coming back to them would be if they ended up with some excess allowances that they could turn around and sell to someone, correct?
As a sort of net revenue from the program, yes.
Okay. Let me pass along. I don't have anything else right this moment. I might have another check.
Commissioner Davis,
Not at this time, thank you.
Commissioner Bierke.
Thank you. Please let me know if you have trouble hearing me. Could you please review the concept of a conditional allowance again? You went through that pretty quickly because that's not in Virginia's, right? There is not a term conditional allowance in Virginia.
Not in Virginia's program as it exists now. That's right, Commissioner. That was the way that Virginia proposed to do it originally. They finalized the rules that would use that structure and then receive legislative authority and change the way the auction works.
Could you just describe how it works?
Sure. Yeah. So, in that initial allocation to the emitters, the allowances that the state allocates to them are they call them conditional allowances. The condition is that they can be sold into RGGI, but they can't be used for compliance until they've gone through the auction. So that's what it is. The emitter can't say, okay, great, thank you, hold on to that, and I'll turn it back in when I need to cover my emissions.
And I'm curious in explaining why we have the authority of the definition of pollutant, why the Massachusetts versus EPA ruling wasn't used as part of your rationale for carbon dioxide being declared pollutant.
Yes, Commissioner Deerhake, we discussed it pretty extensively in the petition, and I'm pretty confident we represent or we reference Mass via the EPA, which is at the federal level, is basically carbon dioxide is a pollutant under the Clean Air Act. It's just we have very limited time to present here and try to contain it specifically to how it would be interpreted and applied under North Carolina law, which is, of course, what you would be focusing on.
Operationally, who is envisioned as an agent of the state when it refers to the Division of Air Quality or its agent?
That would be RGGI Inc.
RGGI itself. Okay. And then could you also explain the decision on how the revenues are managed by giving, I don't recall the exact section number that's proposed in the petition, but there's a section that says Utilities Commission will pass the money along to the regulated community, the utilities, to apply and use the money as they see appropriate with some general guidelines. Is there no opportunity for any revenues for this Department of Environmental Quality to have funds to help manage the program?
We did not structure it that way, Commissioner. the result of some features of state law. We thought the best route was to pass the revenue to the emitters without using it for administrative purposes. That's the short of it.
Thank you. Commissioner Lazar, could you join us? I don't believe she's there. So Commissioner Monas.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. In states that have already adopted RGGI, what has the economic impact been?
It has been pretty substantial. There are a number of reports on it, Commissioner. The best one that I've seen, or rather, finds a net economic benefit of about $4 billion. That's the sort of revenue that has come in from the auction is also in kind of the low billions, and the results. A lot of that is the result of investing the revenue in a number of beneficial kind of areas that the states have chosen to do, like energy efficiency, clean energy, low-income bill assistance. So it's been a huge boon, and those states have seen the existing RGGI states have seen economic growth about what I've seen about 31% greater than non-RGGI states. So tracing that causation is a little hard, but it certainly hasn't been holding it back.
And how about, we're just coming out of COVID, people have struggled to pay their energy bills. Do you have any insights into what the impacts would be on what people pay for their electricity?
We do from the A1 report. So there are a number of ways you can handle the revenue, and we didn't feel that a rule issued by this commission should try to tell the Utilities Commission what to do. But what the A1 report shows is, if you don't recycle any of the revenue, the worst bill impact would be about $2 for residential customers. But if you pass it through to customers, they end up saving money on their bills. And there's kind of a small line in the report, but I think it's really important, where they say, if you look at passing it through just to low-income customers, then they see about a $15 a month decrement on the bills.
Thank you. Those are my questions.
Couple. First would be, could you forecast a little bit for us if this committee were to recommend the rule to go forward to the full commission, and that were to be voted out to go to notice, public notice and comment, and it were adopted? Could you forecast what other steps the state, other agencies, or DQ might have to do after the rule were to go into effect?
Well, going forward from here, Chair Arata, is this committee will recommend to the full EMC, if it were to recommend approving the petition, then the EMC at the special meeting that's called for July 13th were to vote to send that to rulemaking. It would begin the rulemaking process as if you had just initiated your own rule. So the next steps will be, this is going to have substantial economic impact. It's going to trigger the need for a fiscal note. We think that a lot of the work that's already been done in analyzing economic impacts in the A1 report will be helpful in getting that fiscal note done. So hopefully that won't take as long as it might. But once that moves forward, it'll go to the register, be noticed like any other rule for a notice and comment period. After the close of that comment period, it will likely include public hearings. It will come back to the commission with that hearing record for consideration of adoption as a final rule. If the commission at that point decides to adopt the rule or adopt the rule with changes that are within some limits that you have, to a final rule that it would then go and approves it. It would then need to go through the Rules Review Commission. That's been set up to get their very specific input on the rule, which I'm sure in your other rulemaking you probably have become familiar with. At that point, if it comes out, when it comes out of the Rules Review Commission, there's another trigger that's been put in the APA on rulemaking that it would need to get to that point 25 days before the start of the legislative session. So that's really in terms of urgency of acting on this is, I think right now, if things progress normally, if you were to move this forward, there's a chance of that occurring before the 2022 legislature comes back in, meeting that target. If it does not move efficiently and beginning today, I think it would be a challenge to do that, which would cost another year having to wait for the beginning of the next legislative session for the final rule.
Just to follow up and maybe put a finer point on it. If this commission were to adopt the rule, would that automatically trigger the state of North Carolina joining RGGI? Or would there be other things that have to happen before joining RGGI happens?
Our view is that it would put in, this is based on the model rules. We did our best to make sure that this rule, if adopted, would meet RGGI requirements, but they would ultimately have to agree and approve on that, we think it sets in place the what is required, and it would be a statement of your intent as a commission to proceed as you've written the rule. But you would have to get another party involved. RGGI Inc. will have to approve it. But I think it sets the commission on a course to joining RGGI.
Thank you. Okay, going back down the list. I'm looking at Chair Nyberg, who's looking at me, so if you'd like to say something right now. Chair Nyberg. Go. Okay, we don't stick with alphabetical. All is lost. Commissioner Herron.
I am working still through the commission to understand it, but I guess the basic question, currently in North Carolina, is there any financial benefit from RGGI as a non-RGGI state currently?
That's an interesting question, Commissioner. So a benefit to being outside of the state, I don't really see that. The investments resulting from the revenues are always in RGGI states. And we covered briefly the kind of economic impacts that are contained to RGGI states. So I'm not really seeing a path to benefiting from being outside of it.
Commissioner Keene has not joined us yet today, but Commissioner McAdams.
No questions.
Commissioner Nyberg.
Yes, thank you. I had a couple. One is, and I'm sorry to be sort of dense on this, is if you just review the consignment process again, because that is somewhat distinctive about the way in which regulated utilities would get their allowances, then have to sell them back at the auction, have to have them participate in the auction, and then essentially buy allowances as they need them back. Could you go through that one more time?
Certainly, Commissioner. Would you like to do it with the
Whatever's easiest for you.
Yeah. Well,
That in some ways is the most
if I just,
unusual and difficult part of the presentation, at least for me.
I think we're going there. So what you said is exactly right. So the conditional allowances go in, are passed to the emitters, and they have that condition on them. There's nothing requiring the emitters to do anything with them. They could hold on to them, but they can't. Oh yeah, great. They can't be turned right back in for compliance. Thanks. Okay, all right. Yeah, so here we go. So our little consignment shop. So here's
I'm glad to see DEQ would have new officers. results of success.
Yeah, right, yeah, so the little green squiggly I made, you could think of that as, it means money is coming back, or it's just for gift for money. I'm not sure if you can see these term markers, but
Yeah, I can't. We have.
you've got the, oh, you've got, yeah, all right. Okay, perfect. Yeah, so then the emitters, it wouldn't really make sense to just sit on them if they can't be used for compliance. So we expect they would sell them into the auction, and that's them kind of becoming usable allowances in the auction. They get the money back because they do become usable allowances. And that's where the Utilities Commission kind of has that role, overseeing it. And then emitters that could be the same emitter right there, or it could be somebody else. Anyone just who has to cover emissions can buy them from the auction. Actually, non-emitting entities can also.
So just to clarify on that, on step one, there's an allocation made by DEQ of these conditional allowances to the emitters. Is that proportional to their emissions now?
Yes, or yeah, that's a great question. It is. It starts out proportional to their emissions. It's to they call them CO2 budget units in the rule.
Right.
It's proportional to their emissions, and then it's actually they call it an output-based allocation. So it updates depending on how much energy they're producing over time.
So basically, if somebody gets these conditional allocations, and in the meantime decide to make investments to reduce they get their allocation based on past performance. If in the meantime they reduce their carbon emissions so they're going to need fewer credits for compliance, they sell the conditional allowances on the RGGI market. They then have to buy allowances for compliance, but if you've been able to sell more than you had needed for compliance, you get a windfall. Or not windfall is the wrong, not really the word I want to use, but essentially it is to your benefit to reduce your carbon emissions below what they were when you got the conditional allowances. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
Okay, so the incentives are working in the right direction.
Yes. Yes, they are.
The second question I had is more.
I'll maybe leave that up there.
Which is how would in the RGGI system right now, they make adjustments for what's the word I would use, for basically carryover allowances. But apparently when RGGI got started, there were certain allowances that were allocated that they haven't actually had to use, and they've been making adjustments. I think there was a third adjustment that just was announced to be able to basically drive down some of the excess allowances in the system now. How would that affect, or what would happen if North Carolina joining RGGI? How would that play into that dynamic in RGGI Inc.? I don't think I asked that question very effectively. Sorry.
No, I think that was great, Commissioner. I think I know what you're talking about. Those are the adjustments for banked allowances.
Yeah, that's what the word I was looking for. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, so you're allowed to bank. We included that in our proposed rule. It creates an incentive for earlier emission reductions. So if you're an emitter, maybe you think the price is going to go up, or maybe you do that reduction that you just talked about, and you say, I want to hold on to these to use for compliance later on. You're allowed to do that. But if a bunch of people do that, then it loosens the cap later on. So what RGGI has come up with are these adjustments that are kind of they tighten the cap as time moves on to account for the allowances that entities have banked. But since we would be joining right after an adjustment, we wouldn't participate in that at this stage.
Right, but the point is that the bank allowances people will be able to use these, and you could now still, if you thought that the price of this was going to go over time, you might go try and buy as many allowances as you can as an investment. So that if you bought them at $8 and you think the price is going to $16, you might hold on to your allowances to then be able to sell them later and make money on this. So that is part of the way the RGGI market would work. Is that correct?
That's correct. One could do that.
And there are some firms who are doing that now.
Yes, I believe so.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Commissioner Solomon.
I wasn't going to ask any, but I want to follow Chairman Myberg's lead with this. So of the 40 million tons, that's what DEQ is allocating in this first. Commissioner Carter mentioned 40 tons annual CO2 emissions. Is that what they're giving out to everybody in this step one here? Is that what's being spread out?
So we have the number in our proposed rule. I think it's a little over 38 million tons.
38, roughly 40, okay.
Yes.
And then a dollar value, do they just give out the credits, they don't put a dollar value on those when they give them out, correct?
That's right.
Okay, so just let the market, the Reggie market decide what they market will be.
Exactly.
Okay. The other question I have, and I just have two, it's not my committee, but, as we look at these, legislative actions, and let's say you make it by the legislative year next year, when's the first time that somebody in North Carolina will be, an industry will have to pay out money to comply with Reggie? What year would that be roughly? How much time do they have?
So we wrote the rule ambitiously for a January 1st, 2022 start date. That would be probably too soon to get done in time. But we wrote it to update so that if it takes longer than that, it starts on January 1st of the year after the rule is final. So hopefully January 1st, 2023.
So industries have about a year to get ready for this, for these outlays that they have to. Is that right?
Oh, yeah. Franz is reminding me that there's the 3-year compliance period. So they don't have to actually turn them in until later on. And I would say, I hope they're getting ready now.
Well, the rule just got introduced as a draft rule committee, so I don't know if they're getting ready now or not, but, do you have to wait for Reggie? You just mentioned to follow on with that Reggie to open up their market. Will we be trading inside of North Carolina first before we put this on a Reggie market, or is it all go to Reggie? Is there a cycle for that too that delays us further?
No, sir. We would be trading on the full auction from the start.
On January 1st of 2023, probably.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, Commissioner Vanderburg.
Got two questions. So just make it clear here, if it's in other states, the state itself issues the allowances and they send them to Reggie and the money goes back to the state. This is slightly different. It goes to the emitters and then it goes to Reggie. Is that the difference there?
There might be generally, yes.
And so the deal there is that if the money accrues to the state, then the legislature decides what has to happen with the money. This way, the PUC makes a decision as to how that money is spent.
For the regulated utilities, yes.
Right. And so, and as far as the market price, my understanding of the regular market is it's not a real market. There's a ceiling and there's a cap and then there's a de minimis, I think. So it trades within those limits. Is that right? Like that $13 was the cap, and I think you got a $3 or something. So it's somewhere in between. So Virginia, I forgot what they ended up with the first quarter auctions. They produced. That's what it is. It's produced $43 million. So they're thinking, if the price stays about that way, that's a state that's similar size to North Carolina. It's going to be about $170 million that gets paid for. You make it out like the utilities are making money. The regulated community is paying that money that they end up having to use to buy the allowances they end up needing, right? So there is a cost. The cost is, in the case of Virginia, $170 million annually is what they're predicting. And that cost goes to the ratepayer, presumably in some way, depending on how PUC handles that. Is that right?
It depends on how the Utilities Commission
Right.
handles it.
And I don't see Duke asking their shareholders for it, but the other thing is we're only talking CO2 here. We're not talking greenhouse gases. We're talking purely CO2, right?
That's
So reductions made in CO2 at the expense of increased methane emissions are not handled. And what we've seen in Reggie states is most of the generation has gone from coal because they've been shutting down because of the mercury rule to natural gas. And you're seeing reduction.
Well, I guess what I would say is, what the A1 report predicts is that we would end up building about half as much gas as we otherwise would. And it shows that we end up running gas less.
That's not what we've seen in Reggie states to date, but now there has been leakage. There has been leakage, and leakage is something you haven't talked about. but it's interesting to bring up because there's no prohibition for non-Reggie states to wheel power into Reggie states.
That's right, it's a connected grid.
What they've seen in other reports is there's been more generation outside wheeling it into the Reggie state. So you kind of have an artificial reduction in CO2 emissions due to electricity generation in Reggie states because some of that electricity, you've essentially exported some CO2 emissions while you're importing some power. And that's a problem because you're not getting the environmental benefits that you might, because it's not a national program.
I would disagree with a lot of that, Commissioner, but.
Is there
a
leakage?
question?
Is there any leakage? Do you think there is leakage going on right now?
There is some leakage, that's all.
Now, on a different issue though, is this idea of CO2. Why do we limit it to CO2 when a national program includes other GHGs?
That's the GHG that comes out of the stack. It's a kind of.
You don't think methane comes out of emissions points?
Well, it comes out of emission points, but not out of the stack.
Oh, that makes a difference where global warming is concerned, where it comes from? I don't think so. That's all.
We may have additional questions, but I would like to ask our speaker to go back to address the point more fully about leakage. If Mr. Jimenez.
Oh,
Yes.
sorry, I was thinking of other things. Thanks, Commissioner. Yeah.
Refresh your memory, leakage.
Yeah, leakage. I'd be happy to. So, that is definitely something we've considered. Reggie states do monitor it. It's a connected power grid, so they do pull energy from other places. It's been the carbon price has been modest enough that they have not found that it has caused a lot of leakage. And I think for our state in particular, I like to think of the four cardinal directions to kind of get a handle on leakage because different things are happening in different places. We're not really pulling anything from the east yet till that offshore wind kicks in. From the north, those states are in Reggie. There's no leakage within Reggie. So, there are additional generation going on there. That's still within the same budget. We don't have a lot of transmission capacity to bring in from the west. And then from the south, Duke Energy only owns about one, maybe two gas plants in South Carolina. And we think there are some provisions of South Carolina law that would prevent them from building a bunch of new gas down there, not to mention some practical concerns like being easier to build on a brownfield site. So we are not terribly concerned about leakage. If that does become a concern for Reggie states as they go through their program reviews, I think we'd be better positioned to have North Carolina at the table and dealing with it.
Well, Commissioner Carter might have a follow-up, but if I could just one more.
Oh, no, yeah.
Does Duke Energy operate in any Reggie states currently?
I don't believe so.
Okay, do you have, it's okay if you don't have it on the top of your head, but do you know which utilities operate in those states?
Boy. Yeah, well, I'll pass it. I know a couple. I'll pass it to Franz.
I don't have the list right in front of me, but just off the top of my head, directly north, you have Dominion. You have Appalachian Power, which is American Electric Power in Dominion, or in Virginia. You have some co-ops in Virginia, some large, one very large one in particular. And then going into Maryland, Maryland is a deregulated state, so the utilities are distribution only, and they have merchant generators there, including Exelon Corporation. Is that what you mean?
That's what I mean. Thank you. Commissioner Carter?
Yeah, just, well, a couple of follows. One, I'm not sure. I just realized, well, two things. First of all, let me make a correction because I was off on my number. It's not 400 million at $8 a ton. It would be, or $8 an allowance. It'd be about slightly over 300 million. So, but in the ballpark anyway. But a significant amount of money we're talking about. But I guess I don't think I got quite an answer to or understood the answer to who is getting that 300 million when the initial auction takes place.
Well, the way the consignment auction works, those allowances are given to the emitters, so they get the money back for them.
Oh, wait, and when we discussed this earlier, I thought we were clear that the utilities have to buy their allowances, they're not allocated to them.
Well, they're allocated the conditional allowances, but they also have to buy allowances to cover their commissions.
Well, yeah, correct, but, so as between the two, the allocation versus the consignment, what proportion are we talking about, half, three quarters, how does that work out then?
It should be about the same unless, as Chair Myberg was talking about, the emitter decreased their emissions more quickly than anticipated.
Just a question, they can't use the allowances that they get given by DEQ for compliance. They have to go through, there's a transactional cost that Reggie wants. And so those allowances, if Duke wants to emit a ton of CO2, even though they've got a vault full of allowances that were given to them by DEQ, they have to buy an allowance out of the Reggie market.
Okay.
If I may, Commissioner, maybe explaining it just a little bit differently will help. You raised the acid rain program under Title IV, where allocations are handed out for free, and then the utilities can use them for compliance. The effect of the consignment auction is not really that different from that, because you're giving the allowances to the emitters. And they get the revenue back. The only difference is they have to submit the allowances to the auction, have them sold in a transparent process that everyone can see, and then they get the money back. Yes, they do still have a compliance auction, so they need to obtain allowances
right.
at auction as well, but they're paying the same price that they're getting for the allowances they submit. So if it helps, you can think about it as being very similar to Title IV.
Well,
in that effect.
Well, the way you just described it makes it sound like it's a net zero then, as far as their costs.
Well,
That's not what I thought I understood from the rest of this discussion.
Well, just like in Title IV, if I'm given more allowances than I need because I've lowered my emissions, I can sell the excess allowances on the open market and use that money, as Commissioner Myberg indicated. That is also true here. If you lower your emissions, you'll end up selling more allowances through the auction than you have to buy at auction. So you have a net gain there.
Well, if you can lower your emissions that much, but you've got to cover your emissions, provide your electricity to your customers to start with.
Right, but emissions are going down, and those emissions reductions are happening at these very sources. So,
well, that really say there may be a whole slew of reasons for that, including leakage.
So you don't need
from out of state.
You don't need Reggie. You're getting the reductions anyway. But there are transactional costs. How much does Reggie take out of the pie?
For the current Reggie states, they don't take. I mean, the states have to pay for the auction platform.
So how does
but they don't take out. They don't take out of the.
How does the state get the money to pay Reggie then?
The states that use it as a revenue generating auction, they pay directly. They pay
out of the actual income.
I mean, you could characterize it that way. Yeah.
And just to make it clear, does your rule have the PUC getting the money or Duke getting the money?
It would go back to the emitters.
And of course, that revenue though has to be dealt by PUC as to how you score that.
That's right.
I think the expectation on that is the funds come back to the emitters, to the state Duke. Duke is regulated by the Utility Commission, and that whole set of laws on allowing Duke to get a reasonable rate of return will be factored into that, because you have this additional money. The commission will look at it in terms of what's the reasonable rate of return for the utility to get in its periodic review of its rates. And it's all transparent. Everybody knows what every dollar is. It's not some hidden process. So the Utility Commission can factor that in to its decision regarding rates.
Right, but if it's a completely zero-sum game, that's not an issue. Like, Duke buys a allowance for $13, and they sell one for $13, so it's a complete wash. But we have to look at this as the cap starts to decline. that price is going to, the number of allowances is going to be dropped below the amount of CO2 that they're actually emitting. And that's when you get the pinch. Do they spend the money to, in some way to reduce their emissions? You start getting leakage coming in because the price of electricity that you wheel in, it drops below the price that is in, that Duke is charging it for. You know, that's when the dynamics start. But it's kind of hard for us to wrap our head around when it makes it sound like you're saying, you know, we're going to give you 100 allowances, dude. You take the 100 allowances, you can't use them for compliance, but you give them to this third party. And then when you emit 100 tons, you have to go get them, you have to pay them, but you just sold them for the same amount that you're buying for, so it's a zero-sum game. Kind of confusing. But there are transactional costs. Reggie doesn't do this for free. And in the future, as that cap starts to decline, I think you're going to start seeing some real costs.
Okay, if we could have one comment from SCLC in response to what Commissioner Vanderbilt said, and I believe Commissioner Carter might have one final question, and then I'll go ask her final question so we can move on to our next speaker right after that.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to briefly elaborate a little bit on my colleague's answer to Commissioner Vanderbilt on the what happens in the Utilities Commission. So I think you're probably familiar with, you know, environmental compliance costs generally, and what happens with those for the regulated utilities is those get decided in the annual fuel clause adjustment proceedings, because the statute has defined fuel-related costs to include things like reagents to run scrubbers and that sort of thing. And the Utilities Commission in the past has interpreted that to include costs and revenues from purchase and sale of emissions allowances. So the utility would recover its environmental compliance costs, but then those would be offset by revenues. And I think that is where, I can't remember which of my colleagues alluded to the $2 a month average bill increase for residential household, but that is where that would come from, is that recovery through the annual fuel clause adjustment. And it's a straight pass through. There's no return on equity or on the costs.
Commissioner Carter, final question.
Yes, and I want to make sure I understood the answer that you gave to the question from the chair a little bit ago, because we were talking, she asked me about the procedural process here and how it worked and so on and so forth. And I think I heard you say that once this commission adopted a rule, that would be the end of the process in effect, and we would somehow or another state would be automatically into Reggie. There'd be no action by the governor, the legislature, anybody further. Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah, so maybe the example of New Jersey is illustrative here. The governor matters. So once this rule is in place, it would allow North Carolina to accept allowances from Reggie states. And in turn, Reggie states could choose to accept North Carolina's allowances. And that's essentially what Reggie is. It's a collection of states. They each have their own individual programs, which are represented in their individual state rules. And the only way they are connected in the sense of the program is that they've decided that they will accept allowances from other states and in exchange for the acceptance of theirs. So it's a mutual reciprocity. I will add, of course, that they've also decided that they will do certain things like carry out the auction together because it just makes sense. They all pay a lot less. You know, it's much cheaper to pool resources and carry out things, carry out the program together. So that's what Reggie Inc. does as the agent. But so if you get this rule on the books, that's not the end of the story. The governor would then have discussions with, or DEQ would have discussions with the other Reggie states to make sure everything lines up and that they're ready to accept each other's allowances as a practical matter.
Thank you. Commissioner Deerhagen, did you have a follow-up?
I know a lot of the discussion is focused on the process and the cost, but I also would like to just give you an opportunity to comment on your views of the broader and longer range co-benefits of participating in a program like this. both primary and secondary co-benefits.
Thanks, Commissioner. Yes, so there have been a number of studies on that. I mean, so I would start by saying, you know, what the report projects is this steep reduction in CO2. That comes from turning down coal generation, turning down gas generation. And when you turn those down, as the A1 report says, the reduction in the co-pollutants like SO2 and NOx tracks that reduction. So you see by 2030, projects about a 50% reduction in NOx and about a 40% reduction in SO2 for North Carolina. And there have been 3 or 4 good studies on the health benefits in the existing RGGI states, and they've seen that play out. The figures are in the billions in health benefits, a couple $100 million for children's health in particular. You know, so that's a complicated calculation, but it's very substantial.
Commissioner Bailey, do you have any other questions? Commissioner Bailey?
No, I don't. It just took me a minute to unmute. Sorry.
Yeah, understood. We can't see each other today, so delays are inevitable. Commissioner Davis?
I do have one question. I know, just briefly, how effective has the clean energy plan that's already in place been, and what is the additional benefit of entering into this agreement?
I would say it's been very effective, Commissioner, in sort of mapping out what we need to do. But we need to start taking the concrete steps to get there. You know, we had a climate action plan in the state about 10 years ago, and it hasn't turned into action. So that's really kind of a critical piece of why we filed this, is to make sure that it starts turning into concrete policy steps.
Any other follow-ups? Commissioner Monist?
I'd like to follow up on Commissioner Davis's question. I wanted to return to the discussion about how emissions in North Carolina are trending in the right direction. And as you noted in the petition, Duke Energy has a greenhouse gas emissions reduction goal. They're planning to retire coal plants. So what do you think is the added benefit of participating in RGGI given those trends?
I think, as I noted in the progression, that if you start with the baseline year of 2005, we are about halfway, actually, in North Carolina to a 70% reduction, which is the combined effect of a lot of different actions. The Smokestacks Act, incidentally, had significant reduction, resulted in significant reductions in carbon dioxide emissions. Coal plants have been retired. The legislature has enacted a clean energy standard that requires that certain percentages of energy production be procured from renewable sources. It has led North Carolina to be, I don't know how you count it, number 2 or number 3 in the nation in solar capacity. So a lot of that is going on. If you look at the A1 report, this really kind of jumps out. If you just look at that chart, RGGI is a key attribute of RGGI as an option is it pushes carbon intensive generation out of the mix. Clean energy standards can bring on and pull on. RGGI, because of the efficiency of the market, is cheaper than the clean energy options. If you look at the clean energy options, they're relatively expensive compared to RGGI. So frankly, from our perspective, some combined approach of RGGI and the efficiency pushing off carbon and a clean energy standards bringing more on would serve the state's interests. Clean energy standards up to the legislature. We've been encouraging them. We're involved in the REPS, that's Senate Bill 3 years ago for the renewable energy portfolio standards. House Bill 589 that extended some of those benefits. Everyone's going to be arguing for more of that. There will be something there, but we think RGGI can be this force to push carbon off and actually moderate the cost of bringing more clean energy in, why it should be a key part of the state's overall strategy.
And I would imagine it might also provide some more regulatory certainty.
Yes, I mean, it's very straightforward. You would set out in the regulation everything that's expected over a pretty long period of time that would allow the emitters and the utilities to effectively plan around implementing this.
Thank you.
Thanks to our speakers thus far. So we've been going an hour and 15, but I think folks might be able to use a quick break to stretch their legs. So let's come back in, apologies, come back in 10 minutes at 10:25.
Water in and out of there.
At the Charlotte Pipe and Foundry Company is Frank Patterson here. Okay.
Good morning, Chair Arata, and Chair Myberg, and members of the AQC and the ENC. My name is Fern Patterson. I'm an attorney with Parker, Poe, Adams, and Bernstein. And I appreciate the opportunity to speak today on behalf of my client, Charlotte Pipe and Foundry, in opposition to the petition for rulemaking. Generally, being overly quiet has not been a problem for me. So, of course, but speaking too fast is. So if I start to race your hand and I'll note it and slow down. Charlotte Pipe and Foundry, my client, is a family-owned business. They've been operating in North Carolina since 1901. Parkdale Mills is a textile manufacturer that's been operating in Gaston County, North Carolina since 1916. And they are joining in the remarks that I'm delivering today. The points that I raise in opposition are simple, but they're important. First, we believe that voluntarily entering the state into RGGI in advance of a federal approach to limit greenhouse gases from the power sector is ill-advised and has potential negative consequences to the state of North Carolina. Second, states that have entered into RGGI have touted the effectiveness of generating revenue through the carbon dioxide allowance auctions. However, and I think contrary to some of the presentation materials from the petitioner, it's not clear that joining RGGI has actually resulted in CO2 emissions reductions in participating states. I think there's an issue of causation there, that there's a lack of showing of cause. Although potentially well-intentioned, the North Carolina ratepayer could shoulder the financial burden of the cap and trade program under RGGI without the program actually realizing any material carbon dioxide emissions reductions from the power sector that would not be already occurring. Third, we believe that it would be inappropriate and potentially unlawful for North Carolina to join RGGI through an administrative rulemaking process. I'll keep my remarks brief and direct, but I urge each of you to keep these simple points in mind as you consider the petition for rulemaking that's before you today. The Biden administration made clear its intent to put the world on a sustainable climate pathway. That last little quote there is from the Biden executive order on tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad, which President Biden issued on January 27th, 2021, in the very first week of his administration. With climate change placed squarely at the top of the administration and US EPA's priority list, a national approach to regulating greenhouse gases from the power sector is all but certain. We urge EMC to reject the petition requesting that North Carolina join RGGI in advance of and independent from the coming federal strategy to address the issue on a national level. In 2015, the Clean Power Plan was promulgated by EPA under the Obama administration. The plan established state-specific greenhouse gas reduction goals for the power sector based on a 2012 baseline emission rate, or baseline year. North Carolina saw then, under the Clean Power Plan, that EPA did not consider or give North Carolina credit for voluntary actions that it had previously taken to reduce emissions within its borders. In 2002, North Carolina passed this Clean Smokestacks Act, followed by the Renewable Energy Portfolio Standard in 2007. As Mr. Carter mentioned in his presentation, there were significant co-benefits of the Clean Smokestacks Act that reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the power sector within the state significantly. We've also seen under the Renewable Energy Portfolio Standard a tremendous surge in the development of renewable wind and solar resources within the state. Nonetheless, when the Clean Power Plan was promulgated in 2015, it established a goal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from North Carolina's power sector by 32% based on that 2012 emissions baseline year. This did not consider North Carolina's significant independent efforts to reduce emissions from power generation within its borders, beginning a full decade prior. This put North Carolina at a competitive disadvantage to neighboring states such as Tennessee, Georgia, and South Carolina that had not taken any such voluntary efforts. These neighboring states were therefore able to develop plans to meet their respective state-specific goals under the Clean Power Plan through generational shifts away from coal-fired power production, essentially starting where North Carolina had already begun a decade prior. It's very likely that the Clean Power Plan or some permutation of it will be proposed at the federal level again very soon, and perhaps even by the end of the year. The EPA did not give North Carolina credit for its independent and voluntary actions to reduce emissions when it established the Clean Power Plan, and there's no indication or reason to believe that EPA or the White House will change course as it crafts a national strategy for regulating CO2 emissions from the power sector under this new administration. The rulemaking sought through this petition puts North Carolina taxpayers at risk of incurring millions of dollars in costs, only to create an unlevel playing field and put itself at a competitive disadvantage with other southeastern and mid-Atlantic states when the federal strategy is put forth and implemented. As I mentioned in my introduction, Charlotte Pipe and Foundry is a family-owned business that's been operating in North Carolina for over a century. With over 1,600 employees, Charlotte Pipe and Foundry is investing $400 million to construct a new foundry in Stanley County. The new foundry will replace its operations in downtown Charlotte, Mecklenburg County, and will result in a significant reduction in emissions of criteria pollutants, toxic air pollutants, and greenhouse gases. These emissions reductions will be achieved largely by converting the melting process at the Mecklenburg foundry, which is a coal-based coke combustion process, to a state-of-the-art electric melting system. By eliminating approximately 15,000 tons of coke combustion per year through the innovative electric process, as well as installing state-of-the-art emissions controls, the new foundry will be a non-Title V synthetic minor source. The existing foundry is a major source under the new source review program. The greenhouse gas emissions due to the elimination of coal combustion is equivalent to approximately 19 megawatts of power production from coal combustion. So essentially eliminating 19 megawatts of power production from coal production. This is a prime example of electrification, which is the shifting of energy sources from direct fuel firing to electricity that is generated using more efficient and lower emitting fuels and processes. Governor Cooper has also promoted multiple initiatives to reduce greenhouse gases by electrifying the transportation sector. That's included in Executive Order 80, which was mentioned in SCLC's presentation, which established a goal of increasing the number of electric, zero-emission state-owned vehicles on the road to at least 80,000 by 2025. Emissions reductions through electrification, of course, rely upon electricity. Charlotte Pipe's new foundry in Charlotte and Stanley County will be a significant industrial user of electricity generated by the North Carolina power sector. The petition rulemaking would have a significant impact on rates paid by Charlotte Pipe and Foundry, as well as Parkdale Mills and other industrial ratepayers, as well as potentially commercial and residential ratepayers. It's our position that joining RGGI, even as EPA and the White House are on the verge of proposing a national approach to regulating greenhouse gases, is ill-advised, potentially puts North Carolina at a disadvantage to its neighboring and nearby states, and passes costs along to North Carolina ratepayers without proven environmental benefits. There are serious questions about whether RGGI is actually effective at achieving its purported primary goal, reducing greenhouse gases from the power sector. RGGI is composed of the CO2 budget trading programs in each of the participating states, and each of the participating states issues those CO2 allowances and establishes participation in these quarterly regional allowance auctions that were discussed in SCLC's presentation. The states, or in this case, the NCUC, along with the electric generators, can reinvest the revenue generated from those quarterly auctions as it sees fit. I think there is some question, and my understanding from the presentation is that in the proposed rulemaking, it's not appropriate to dictate how NCUC will manage those funds. So I think how those funds would be reinvested, what are the guidelines, and whether the requirements there remains unknown and would remain unknown based on the proposed rulemaking. By all accounts, RGGI's been very effective at generating income in the participating states. The Center for Climate and Energy Solutions boasts that RGGI's participating states saw a net economic benefit of $4.7 billion from the cap and trade program between 2009 and 2017. When Virginia joined RGGI in 2020, it projected revenue benefits of greater than $100 million annually. But RGGI has not proven effective in actually reducing the emission of greenhouse gases from the power sector that would have not already occurred. The U.S. Energy Information Administration reports that since peaking in 2007, total energy-related carbon dioxide emissions have declined by 14.5%, due in large part due to the increasing share of natural gas generation within the power sector. I think what we've seen in the prior presentation is that the reductions in CO2 emissions in North Carolina have been even greater. Increasing natural gas utilization in the power sector is concomitant with increasing domestic production and lower prices of natural gas, as well as Commissioner Vandervaart had mentioned the implementation of the Mercury Rule. And there's scant evidence that RGGI has actually had any material impact on reducing actual CO2 emissions from the power sector in participating states. In short, carbon dioxide emissions from the power sector are in decline, but not because of RGGI. In a report most recently updated in 2019, the Congressional Research Service provided an overview and assessment of RGGI. In its final observations, the service indicated, from a practical standpoint, the RGGI program's contribution to directly reducing global accumulation of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere is arguably negligible. Joint RGGI has the potential to force North Carolina taxpayers to absorb significant costs and increase utility bills without actually lowering GHG emissions within the state. Finally, and in light of our prior two arguments, we believe it's inappropriate and potentially illegal to establish the proposed cap and trade program with such far-reaching impacts to ratepayers through an administrative rulemaking process. The NC General Statutes gives EMC the authority to develop, adopt, after proper study, air quality standards that it deems proper. But I urge you to consider that there has been no proper study conducted in support of the petition for rulemaking. Nor do I think the type of study that is needed here was within the province of NCDEQ or the MC. I think what really sort of drove that home for me and listening to the last presentation is this unknown of how that revenue generation would be spent by the NCUC and the lack of ability to provide any guidelines to that through this rulemaking process of the EMC, that the EMC cannot dictate what the NCUC does. So there's this big unknown of what would be done with that revenue generation if we don't take this through the legislative process, which has that more multidisciplinary approach and could set those guidelines. At the very least, any action with such significant potential impacts to North Carolina ratepayers and with such uncertain results and with these unknowns such as how the NCUC would actually use that revenue generated should be considered through a legislative process to fully review and deliberate on the costs and benefits of implementing RGGI in North Carolina and to fully set forth the guidelines that would actually apply. And with that, I'll conclude my remarks. I thank you again for the opportunity to speak with you this morning and for your thoughtful considerations of the points that I've raised here today. I have a summary of my remarks, which I'll enter into the record. And based on the points raised in my remarks here, I'd like you to think about whether the petition for rulemaking makes sense for North Carolina, and urge you to find that it does not.
Patterson, I can ask you to just stay at that
Sure.
mic. That's not fair. I go background alphabetically. Commissioner Bailey, do you have a question?
No, I don't. Thank you.
Commissioner Carter,
Not at this point.
Commissioner Davis,
Not at this time, thank you.
Commissioner Deerpig.
Thank you. This is the first time I've heard this argument, so I'd like a few minutes to process.
Commissioner Lazorick, have you joined us? No, Commissioner Lazorick. Commissioner Monist. No, thank you. Okay. Oh, I can't let.
I know it made me so nervous today. You got 45 minutes of questions. I thought, oh my God, I don't know if I can talk that long. I guess it's not unwarranted, unfounded fear.
Well, at the risk of picking, can you tell me how Virginia uses the proceeds from its auction revenue?
So, in my understanding, and feel free to jump in, that what I have read, and of course they have just joined, so I don't think they're not receiving those benefits at this point. From what I saw, there were 50% of those revenues would be used to establish a fund to address flooding impacts, maybe in coastal area. I'm not exactly sure where regionally, but that would be a Virginia program to address impacts from flooding. About 45% of that revenue generated would be used to fund low-income energy efficiency initiatives, such as LED lighting, insulation, and low-income housing. And interestingly, I think the remaining 5% would be going to operating costs to the Virginia DEQ, as well as, and probably in relation to this low-income energy efficiency, the operating cost of the Department of Health and Human Services in Virginia. And I do think that their program is different, that revenue generation is actually going to the state, whereas the setup here is a little bit different. I thought I understood it really well, and the more the conversation went, the less I felt like I fully understood how the revenue is used and would be implemented through this proposed rulemaking or through the petition for rulemaking. But in Virginia, I do think that system is a little different.
Okay. And I asked because you mentioned that Reggie generates revenue for states. I mentioned Virginia in that discussion.
Yes.
So that's helpful to know.
Yeah.
One second question is you also mentioned the Biden administration's policy proposals for a more sustainable energy plan and EO80 in North Carolina. Could you point us in the direction of what regulatory actions would have gone into effect as a result of those policy statements?
So I don't think, I mean, certainly with the Biden administration, we don't have any regulatory action at this point. I had mentioned in a presentation recently, I do, and this is my personal belief, I do think that we will see something very similar to the Clean Power Plan come back. And when that was rescinded by the Trump administration, I sort of hope that DEQ didn't throw all their work away because they had their state implementation plans pretty far along. I think that work will come back to good use when we see action from the EPA.
And a final question for me, then I'm going to go back to our committee members and use a little bit more time. It's totally fine. You mentioned that there should be a balancing of costs and benefits in our consideration. Are you excluding the cost and benefits analysis that would come before this commission in a fiscal note?
No. I'm not. No. I think that what I would propose that evaluation of costs and benefits really needs to be done through a legislative process. And I think particularly that not knowing how NCUC and the Utilities Commission would be required to reinvest those funds, it's sort of a fatal flaw to that cost and benefit, because I don't think we know what it is because we have that unknown of how this program would actually be implemented.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Okay.
Looking at the webpage for Reggie on how to join, they refer to two paths. One could be legislative or one could be through executive decision making. And can you tell me which states have gone the executive path versus the legislative path? I know Virginia went.
Right, and that's all I can tell you. And so I went through the Virginia, which is the most recent and the most neighboring state. Virginia did use the legislative path. I can't tell you for the other programs. I think New Jersey actually dropped out of the program at one point, I believe. But for those early participants, I don't know if they did that through a legislative or executive action.
New Jersey is returning through an executive decision. I can understand the concern about the uncertainty with how the going to the North Carolina utilities. What I'm thinking is that this is only the first step in the process, and that there will be an opportunity for the public comment period, folks to voice their ideas about the various aspects of the constitution, language, the text, the rule text. Do you not see that is a one venue for offering amendments that could be valuable for your client, that be more beneficial to your client, for better definition of how the funds could be?
I would still question whether through an administrative action or administrative rulemaking initiated by the EMC, whether the EMC would have any authority to provide the guidelines that would provide certainty to my client on the NCUC.
Okay, and that might actually be a good for example, perhaps offer the statement. The statutory authority would just say that we have discussed the previous one.
I don't even have the ability to blank technical difficulty.
Oh,
sorry. So, is the question about the authority in general, about the utilities commission and the ones there? Because I understand that the petition not advocating in favor one way or the other. So one of the great times I get to hide behind the fact that I don't have a vote on the policy. That's the commission. But as I understand it, no revenue will be generated that would inure to the benefit of the state, it would only be revenue generated to the regulated entities and those regulated entities who are also subject to regulation through the Utilities Commission. Would then have to account for those revenues within the law and the guidelines for the regulations and statutes applicable to them decided upon by the Utilities Commission. So this petition will move forward to control emissions wouldn't relate to impose upon or require the Utilities Commission to take any action one way or the other. They strictly limited it to, I mean, it would require them only to the extent that they have to deal with what they have to deal with. In other words, we're not saying, hey, Utilities Commission, do this. They have to do that by a necessary implication of their own statutes and their own actions. So we're not setting the parameters by which the Utilities Commission has to decide what the answer is, just that this act will trigger their necessary involvement. Does that make sense?
Question if I can.
Commissioner Saul.
If, and Duke is our utility, our investor-owned utility, if they keep growing and they can't comply, they've got to pay money into the pot to the Utilities Commission. And they're going to keep growing. So there's not going to be a status quo. North Carolina's not going to shut its doors. They're going to keep having electricity generated, which is, I think, is what the case is with this attorney is you're going to pass it along at higher rates because those utilities have to raise rates to pay into the system or to make the improvements. Right. And something's going to happen as a result. We can't go into this and say what we're doing is not going to make anybody pay. Somebody's going to pay into it.
No, and I'm sorry, Mr. John, if that's what my remarks were interpreted as. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is absolutely that they are necessarily implicated because this will generate revenues or costs associated with that will have to be dealt with by the Utilities Commission. But we're not saying to the Utilities Commission, where we would be saying to the Utilities Commission, this is how you must decide.
Right.
So we're not saying that.
Right. We wouldn't have that authority.
That's what I'm saying by they're necessarily implicated, but they're not governed by or dictated what the admission.
But you agree we're sending them money. We're going to be sending them money to do something. They're going to have to make decisions based on our rules in here.
I don't know that I would state it that way. What I would say is it will generate revenue or costs to the regulated communities that would necessarily have to be dealt with through the UC. So the money doesn't go directly to the UC, it goes to the pockets, not the pockets, but to the accounts or the regulated communities that each of you would have to account for how they are accepting, they're generating this revenue and how they're expending the cost to comply, right? But the funds are direct to them and not direct to the UC.
But isn't that the same? I guess it's getting into the legal web here, I guess. But Clean Power Plant and the renewable energy program both came back and asked to raise rates. Yeah, they're going to have to pay whether they pay whoever they pay. They're going to pay somebody to do this. The Utilities Commission has got to make a decision whether they're going to let them raise rates, which is what I believe the argument is here. They will raise it. They won't take it out of shareholder profits per se. They're going to take it out and raise utility rates. Well, so this action will force them to make a decision on the matter. Because rates will go up.
Right, I can't say for certain that they will or won't, but you're right that whether rates are increased is a decision for the Utilities Commission. Whether those rates are increased because of rules like this, or for settlements for coal ash, or whatever it may be, in order to raise rates, I don't think I'm straying outside of my area of expertise, but in order to raise rates, they've got to go to the Utilities Commission.
That's right. Okay.
Okay. So I can proceed alphabetically. So Commissioner Harris. No Commissioner Kingsbury. Commissioner McAdams.
No questions.
Commissioner Nyberg.
Sorry, no such luck. I would just observe that the question goes to Commissioner Solomon point. This must be a very interesting time to be in the utility business because there's so much change going on with it. I haven't noticed that Duke has been reluctant to ask for rate increases, regardless of whether or not they were involved in renewable portfolio settings or or other electrical things. But it's interesting because we have countervailing trends at work, that the increased energy efficiency of things always homely as LED light bulbs to other kind of energy efficient motors and generators and that kind of thing has kept the rate of electric consumption less than rates of growth in GDP now for some time, that those two curves have diverged. On the other hand, you're exactly right that there is going to be greater pressure for electrification of a number of different processes, including transportation. And I want to commend your client for their work on electrifying the foundry operation. That's a tremendous set of progress. You're exactly right. That's a tremendous step forward in progress in terms of reducing conventional air pollution. And I'm sure it's going to be well received by your neighbors and by many other people in the state. So good on your client for that. I do have a couple of questions. If you raise the issue of federal responsibility, which I have some familiarity with from past lives. And so my question is, did your client support the litigation against the Affordable Clean Energy Plan?
You know, I cannot say. I've not asked my client about.
Okay, because that's relevant to the discussion about the Clean Power Plan, which, as you noted, was undone with decision by the previous administration. And there seems to be no particular indication by the agency that it is going to just revive the Clean Power Plan. In fact, if anything, they've kind of run the other way on that. So that's kind of an interesting just comment. But specifically to the Affordable Clean Energy Plan, the DC Circuit ruled on January 19th that the Affordable Clean Energy Plan was they basically remanded it to the agency.
Yes.
Because there was an improper reading of statutory authority that the agency had. But that decision has been appealed to the Supreme Court. That the DC Circuit decision vacated the act. Is your client supporting the appeal to the Supreme Court of the vacature of the Affordable Clean Energy Plan?
Again, I cannot tell you. I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is there a specific federal legislative proposal to reduce CO2 emissions that your client would support?
Again, my apologies. I'm here sort of on this, Reggie. I don't know the broader scope of my client's position on this.
And another question, I realize this is being a little bit didactic, but is there a specific state legislative proposal that your client would support?
And I'll repeat, I can't answer your question. No.
My point is that the argument that there's going to be federal action, so we don't need to do anything, seems to me to be not especially compelling, given that there's no specific proposal on the table, and that for whatever the merits of that flaws, this particular one, it is before us. So that to me sort of weakens the argument. We should just wait for the federal government to do something, and we don't really do. That's not a question. That's just it.
Understood. Yep.
Commissioner Solomon, do you have any questions for our speaker? Mr. Vandenberg.
Well, I mean, to your point, Commissioner Marburg, I mean, you know, DEP hasn't come up with any rulemaking either. I think the thing that's so shocking about this to me is that not that somebody wants rulemaking to achieve some reduction, although because of the Commerce Clause, essentially, it's very difficult to do that on a state-by-state basis. But you know, if we're going to have rulemaking, why don't we have rulemaking on number of options rather than this? That's what's sort of offsetting this, and the track record for this one doesn't. This option doesn't appear to be all that great for the cost effectiveness. But anyway, I mean, my point is there's a lot of stuff going on both at the federal level. Not much stuff going on here. This is the only game in town. So I don't know whether our department is you know, they're chilling, or whether they you know, maybe there's some other options that may make sense for that.
It would probably be worth noting that if this commission wanted to adopt the rule and go forward with Reggie, that would not preclude it from taking other actions. And certainly their quality committee would be open to hearing other proposals. I don't believe the division has been sitting idly, to say the least, in the last few months. It certainly has worked very hard on this. Commissioner Carter, if I saw your hand.
I guess I going to have to respond to Chairman Meyer. Do you really think the Biden administration is not going to do anything at the federal level? I mean, I heard I'm not sure I really understand your point, because I don't think there's any doubt whether it's going to be, we're going to see the Clean Power Plan or not. Yeah, I don't know. That's up to our, the new administrator who used to work with us here. But, you know, I really don't get your argument there. I mean, I think the argument that Patterson has made is quite clear for two reasons. Number one, first, I think it's going to be something. But secondly, the fundamental problem I have with the red approach and concept is it's individual states can't accomplish anything serious in this whole exercise. If there's going to be a significant reduction of CO2, it has to be federal. It has to be imposed from a federal level. You're not going to get, Reggie's not just going to extend across the country eventually up to all 50 states. I don't think. I can't imagine that would ever happen. And because it's not, in my judgment, you're not going to get, as Mr. Vandermark pointed out, we're really not getting, and we've seen some of the literature on this, you're not getting significant CO2 reductions overall. Now, you might be able to go and look at numbers out of the Reggie states and say, oh, yeah, look at where it's reduced. But if you go look and look into the leakage issue, I think you're going to find that it's probably offset and maybe even getting a higher CO2 emissions from the non-Reggie states that are making up for the generation that can't be done in the Reggie states because of the limitations on allowances. So, you know, I think that's where we need to be looking at. I'm not saying we shouldn't do anything here. I think we need to look at some things. I think Dr. Vandermark's right. I think we ought to be looking really broadly at a number of things. And I just don't see Reggie as the only game in town, or it shouldn't be. And we've got some procedural questions, but I'm not going to get into that right now. I want to get into it a little bit.
Okay, so I think we have veered away from asking questions to our
Yeah.
presenters. They're very patiently organized time to have this discussion amongst ourselves. Thank you, Ms. Patterson. We're going to hear from two more presenters, and then I'd like to give 2 minutes back to FDLC to respond very quickly to anything that has been said. Our first presenter is Rihanna Ackley from E2. And I will again keep time and wait up to when we get 3 minutes.
Chair Arata, Vice Chair Carter, and distinguished members of the Air Quality Committee, thank you for the opportunity to provide comment today. My name is Rihanna Ackley, and I am the Southeast representative from E2. E2 is a national nonpartisan group of over 11,000 executives, investors, and other business professionals across the country, including nearly 800 professionals in North Carolina, who advocate for smart policies that are good for the economy and good for the environment. I am here today speaking on behalf of E2's business community in North Carolina to ask this committee and the Environmental Management Commission as a whole to approve this petition so that the Department of Environmental Quality can move forward with rulemaking for North Carolina to participate in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, RGGI. From the E2 business community's perspective, RGGI presents a critical opportunity for North Carolina to spur investment and job growth in our state while addressing climate change and advancing a sustainable economy. We're grateful for Governor Cooper's leadership on this issue with Executive Order 80 and the North Carolina Clean Energy Plan. Now is the time for action to achieve the Clean Energy Plan's climate pollution reduction goals, and joining RGGI represents an immediate opportunity for North Carolina to make meaningful progress towards these goals in a way that also stimulates economic development, driving energy bill savings, clean energy investments, and job growth. Demonstrated economic and environmental benefits from RGGI have included deep reductions in carbon emissions, local job creation, and a boost to participating states' economies. Studies have shown states participating in RGGI have generated a net economic benefit of over $4 billion and created almost 45,000 job years since the program began. Additionally, the recent A1 report found that the policy programs such as RGGI would lead to deep carbon reductions, significant job growth in the state, and lower energy bills for residential customers and businesses. The report also forecasts $1.09 billion in carbon allowance proceeds for North Carolina alone from 2023 to 2030, funds that could be reinvested into North Carolina's economy through clean energy projects and energy efficiency or renewable energy. In closing, Participating in RGGI will generate substantial economic benefits in North Carolina and set the state on a path to meet its carbon reduction goals in the lowest cost way. With all that in mind, the E2 business community respectfully asks for your approval of this petition. Thank you for your time and consideration.
Thank you. Our next speaker, next to last speaker is Kathy Buckley from the Alliance to Protect People in the Places We Live. And I will keep time for you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Arata and Commissioners. My name is Kathy Buckley, and I'm Director of Statewide Organizing for the North Carolina Alliance to Protect Our People in the Places We Live, APPLE. I appreciate this opportunity to speak. I'm a native of Massachusetts, and I think RGGI has done well there. I know it can do great things here if we insist. I urge you to protect those now most burdened by climate and other pollutants. I will share one statistic to illustrate the impacts of environmental injustice. In our country, the rate of asthma among Black children is twice that of white children. The asthma death rate of Black children is 7 times higher than that of white children. While power plants and other polluting sites release poisons for free, those living nearby are paying immeasurable costs. I support and laud the petitioner's goals to ensure that RGGI not be used to increase pollution in already highly impacted communities. RGGI should help accelerate the shutdown of coal-powered plants. It is critical that we fly towards solar, wind, and battery storage, and not convert those plants to fossil gas, ignoring the effects of methane leakage from here to the frack gas wells in the Midwest and points in between. And we laud the provision of no pass for biomass. Requiring monitoring is not enough. We must empower overseers of the grid to guarantee that RGGI will not simply decrease overall climate pollution. We must also level the playing field for North Carolinians now breathing the most foul air. There are many ways to support environmental justice communities in formulating RGGI in North Carolina, including attending to coal pollutants and the potential of using funds from the consignment auction to support the energy burden, including energy efficiency measures. I used to think that given the minuscule window of opportunity we have left to turn the tide on climate, a window closing faster every day, that all other matters needed to be set aside. I have come to realize that it is all one. It is how we treat each other, how we treat other species, how we treat our common home. Imagine an administrator at a higher level of the universe looking over humanity's shoulder, using various criteria to assess our success. Let us assume that the overriding criterion is, how does this species treat the least amongst them? If we join RGGI, let us make EJ not a component, but our North Star. Let's lead our country in making energy justice a vision as powerful and compelling as a clean energy economy and a sustainable future. Thank you.
Thank you. And if Mr. Carter from SULC would like to offer a couple minutes of comments and thoughts.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just responded to some of the points that came up and some of the questions that were asked by commissioners. RGGI benefits. RGGI's resulted in a 47% reduction in carbon emissions from the RGGI states, which is 90% greater than the carbon emissions that have been achieved from non-RGGI states during the same time period. I'm waiting for a federal rule. If North Carolina were to join RGGI, that would constitute 14 states that are using this type of approach to address carbon. That would represent over a third of the U.S. population. It's hard to imagine a federal program coming in place that would not build on and incorporate what these states are already doing. Under the Obama Clean Power Plan approach, RGGI compliance was Clean Power Plan compliance. That's how the federal government dealt with the RGGI states during that time. In terms of how states have joined, New York and Pennsylvania joined by regulation, rulemaking, not by legislation. That question was asked. This keeps coming up about the utility commission's involvement. One thing we overlooked that we should have mentioned that's in the rule is that the rule requires the utility to submit a plan to the utilities commission on how these proceeds will be used in the public interest. And that can inform the commission, which in turn has a legal mandate to protect ratepayers. So we understand the issues and concerns, but we believe that there's a process in place between the utility commission and its role that can address those concerns. So those are some points that came up, and that's the major. Oh, there's one more. I think council for the made a very specific question about not proceeding with an air quality standard until there's been a study. The way the statute is set forward is after study. We would submit that there's probably more study of RGGI as an option than you would get in most rulemaking that's been done through the A1 report and that year-long process involving multiple stakeholders with technical support and modeling. So we think there's been extensive study that supports RGGI as a key component of a state strategy to deal with carbon emissions. And we again respectfully request that the committee move this on to the full commission. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we've reached the time to have discussion amongst ourselves to decide what the committee is going to do today. I'm going to go back to Commissioner Bailey and Davis first, since we are not able to see them, see if they have any comments. Commissioner Bailey.
No comment.
Commissioner Davis.
None for me, thank you.
I see Commissioner Carter moving towards the back.
Well, I guess I just go ahead and mention something I mentioned in the email tonight yesterday, which I'm still of the belief that we need to request a formal legal opinion from the Attorney General on this. And I started to craft a longer response back yesterday than they did, but I guess I would simply make these points. First and foremost, talked about the administrative process earlier. If this commission chose to go forward with this rule, adopt it, send it forward, it's going to the Rules Review Commission, and I can't imagine that the Rules Review Commission is would be willing to pass on this thing without some indication, written, clear statement by the Attorney General. This is within the ambit of our legal authority. I think we'd just be asking for the thing to be sent straight back to us if we could have something to point to if this commission decides to go forward. So I was surprised by the reaction at the May meeting to vote down my motion for opinion. I don't want to, I'm not of a mind to force the same vote again, but I would like to at least discuss this a little further, because I think we really do need to think very seriously about this, because I think there's serious legal issues here. The petition have done a very artful job, I would say, in making the argument on legal authority. I'm not persuaded by much of it. But that's also why I think we need someone, a third party that are really independent. In this case, the chief legal officer of the state to take a hard look at this. And then saying all this, let me make it clear one more time, if I haven't made it clear past, this is not to downgrade Philip in any way, shape, manner, or form. But I just don't think that the Rules Review Commission or anybody else that's going to be looking over our shoulder if this thing goes forward, because they, oh yeah, he said something in the commission meeting one day and he said it was okay, so go right ahead. This is just too significant a rule. It's got huge economic consequences, and we're in a position. I've sort of caught by the suggestion that we're gonna direct Duke to require Duke to direct a report to the Utilities Commission. I think the Utilities Commission is going to have something to say about this, and I've always thought that, and going all the way back to the power plant, frankly, that the structure of coming to the EMC with, in that case, the rules that they were, the CPA put forward, or in this case, the kind of thing we're talking about. This commission is just not the right place by itself to be doing this. I mean, maybe whether it should be the utility commission be drawn into this, or I think Ms. Patterson's suggestion is really the best. That this really does need a legislative solution at the state level as well as the federal level. So, all right, I've said a whole lot. I'd be interested to hear what anyone else thinks about renewing my motion. I'm not going to renew it unless I think it makes sense and people are willing to support it.
Could you, I think something that would help me understand what difference you're drawing between this rulemaking petition and past rules that have gone through the RRC. Could you kind of distinguish what it is about this particular petition other than a view that it should start with the legislature? Maybe think of the 111B rules.
Well, I guess to sort of start with the notion that I hear what Mr. Carter said about a lot of study being done here. That may have been, but that's certainly not anything we've looked at closely or carefully. But I guess fundamentally, when I look at the statute, it talks about emission standards and or air quality standards and emission standards. Well, that's not what we're talking about doing here. A CO2 cap with no basis that I know of to say, okay, the right number should be 40 million tons or 30 or 20 or 100 million tons. I don't know where we'd be pulling that out of the air. We don't have any sort of an air quality standard. EPA has never chosen, and that's another thing we might see, I suppose, out of EPA. But EPA has never chosen to go forward with an air quality standard for CO2, which they could have done starting after the Massachusetts case, which is more than 15 years ago now. But we don't have that, so we really have no starting point. I mean, the exercise we're talking about here is simply, oh, okay, we said CO2 is bad, so therefore we need to increase it. But based on what? How far do we need to go, and how is that going to work? There's some other issues as well, but I won't get into as far as the Paris Accords and that whole set of question marks. But I just don't see that this fits clearly within the ambit of what we have authority to do. Most importantly, this notion that even if we said, okay, we've got a basis to say, here's an emission standard, or here's an emission cap for a CO2 in the state, and then to impose on top of it this allowance scheme. The only allowance scheme that I'm aware of that's fully authorized legally is Title IV in the Clean Air Act, and it's in 1990. The credit, banking and credit system that we've got in our statute, it's a voluntary system. That's not what this is. This isn't even remotely a voluntary system. It would be a mandatory system imposed on primarily on Duke, but on a number of others. There's a list there on one of the appendices that I haven't looked at closely of a whole bunch of other folks in addition. They would be subject to this in addition to Duke. Duke would be the one that would be most significantly impacted, I'm sure. So I guess fundamentally, I just don't see that kind of a structure or any basis to impose that kind of allowance structure. I mean, we had to do it, federally through the Title IV. I don't believe the Supreme Court would ever upheld us if we tried to do Title IV without, or do an allowance system for SO2 without Title IV. I think that's the same situation we're in here. We simply don't have any kind of direct statutory authority to support this.
Okay, thanks. That's helpful clarification. Any comments from the committee on Mr. Carter's? Commissioner Meber.
Just a couple of thoughts. First, I respect very much Commissioner Carter's thoughts about this. And as to the legal authority, I think that is a very critical and important question. It was the one that first came to me when we received the petition. And it's only at the consultation council to the commission and hearing from the department that satisfied me can have the legal authority to proceed. Now, I'm not a lawyer like you are, so that's just my reaction as a layperson. I will say that that in terms of this sort of the interplay between state and federal activity on both the executive and legislative branches is a fascinating one in this overall area. My own view about the overall merits of this action, my interest would be in seeing North Carolina achieve as rapid reductions in carbon emissions as can possibly occur. And as to the mechanism for that to occur, I'm kind of agnostic. But I would like to see something. And what I'm uneasy about is the notion that people will oppose something with nothing. And that's where that was really the gist of my question. At the federal level, I actually very much agree that the optimum system would be a national system, which had some kind of market mechanism that would help keep costs down. That was the objective of the SFA proposal, and it worked remarkably from a cost of what thought to be $6 billion turned out to be like $1.5 billion, and now we're way below even those targets. So I think the notion that a market mechanism can help to minimize overall compliance costs is a sound notion. And here we have a case where, for better or for worse, we have 11 states that are already doing this, and they have a cap that will be in 2021 of 119.8 million tons. So there is a cap that these RGGI states are bound to achieve, and it's going to be reducing until it reaches 86.9 million tons in 2030. The good news is we have in fact made progress. All the observations to that effect are exactly right. We have gotten the low-hanging fruit, efficiency benefits, and the benefits of conversion from coal to natural gas, which turns out to be a lot cheaper than it turns out. So all of those things have been beneficial from the standpoint of overall carbon burden. But the next steps forward are going to be harder. They're going to be harder because of the law of marginal costs. And they're also going to be harder because of electrification in other sectors, whether it's transportation or manufacturing or residential or commercial sectors. And that's going to make it harder to, if you look at the charts, the transportation sector is now the largest carbon emitting sector. If that falls off, it'll put more pressure on the electric generating sector. If we don't have some mechanism in place to manage that, you could be just pushing down one and pushing up another. Sort of eternity. And the market mechanism aspect of this is what's most appealing. And it makes it more likely that a cost-effective strategy can be adopted. I really don't know, and I didn't even apply that idea, what the administration is going to do. But I'm certainly mindful of the fact that they themselves are very mindful of the ping-pong effect, where one administration comes in and does something, the next administration comes in and undoes it, the next administration comes in and undoes it again. That's not really a very productive way to conduct public policy. I think how they move forward, I think they are looking for a way to be done something nationally. If something nationally came along that would supersede this, hey, but I just don't see anything like that. And the alternative is to do nothing. That leaves me in a better company. That's kind of Congress to respond to the thought. That's kind of where I am.
Yeah, and I will say immediately that I agree with much of what you said about market-based solutions and so on. I mean, I was very heavily involved in drafting Title IV in 1990. But that to the side, my fundamental point is still simply, if you believe that, and if this is something we think we want to do as far as a market-based solution, don't we want to make sure that we have the underpinning that's going to carry this forward? And that's all I'm asking or suggesting with the legal opinion, to say, yep. Well, I'm assuming it's most likely that the agency can come back and say, yeah, we think you do have the authority. Here it is. Here's how it works. That's really all I'm talking about. I'm not talking about stopping anything. I'm not talking about not doing market-based. I'm simply saying, don't we need that fundamental pillar or piece of this puzzle in order to move this petition and this rule forward?
Commissioner Monis.
Well, I was just going to ask, and Commissioner Carter, the reason last time that I voted against your motion was because I wanted to hear the petitioner speak to the legal justification for authority first. And then we heard from Philip that he would also be prepared to speak, Councilor Reynolds, prepared to speak to that authority as well. So I'm wondering if I can ask you to just say a bit about the basis for the legal authority and whether there's anything incorrect with what the petitioner said about our authority.
Thank you, Madam Chair. One thing I want to be clear on is that it's the petitioner's job to convince you that you have the authority and it's a good policy decision. My responsibility is to give you that independently of them. So I won't say that they are right or wrong. I will tell you what. Fair enough. Okay. I will simply tell you what my review reveals, and I do think authority is very much a relevant question, whether you get that opinion through me as the Attorney General's representative to the commission, representing it. Uh, I do in fact have to go in front of the RRC on occasion to defend and advocate that the commission does have authority to make rules. So whether that's through me or through the Attorney General, through a formal opinion, nevertheless, it would still be my responsibility to continue to advocate that you do if this is the policy option you decide to choose. And if you're satisfied with my answer. Generally speaking, limiting the review solely to the question of whether, and this is what I understood the question to be last time, whether you have the authority to include the credit trading program as part of the emission control or aspect, rather, the credit trading aspect within establishing the emission control standards program. That answer would be based in or be predicated on 143.215.107, which is the same statute that the petitioner referenced in their petitions. Whether it is through setting a standard or establishing an emission control standards program, both are based on the commission's judgment. So if the commission says that the standard is an emissions limit or cap, and if that is the appropriate emission control or emission standards, then in its judgment, the commission likely has the authority to say the manner in which we can apply or this standard can be met includes the use of trading credits or credits in general, credit allowances, not just trading, that's part of it, credit allowances. There is a portion in that same statute, 107, and it's A12. A12 says that you have the authority to create a program of incentives to promote food credits, to promote voluntary reductions. Now, the question that occurred to me at the outset was that a limitation on your general authority to create this program? In other words, if you just have this general authority out here that says you get to do all these things, and then you have something that speaks specifically to what you're talking about, is there a conflict? And if so, which one controls? Well, here, I don't see that as being a conflict. I don't see the A12 and the authority to create rules, to create incentives for voluntary reductions is a specific and express limitation on your general authority to include that as part of the overall program. Now, if it said something along the lines of this is the only way you may use credit trading, then the answer is likely different, but that's not what it says. It just says you have this authority to also do this voluntarily, which I view, I think this is consistent with the rules of statutory construction. I view that as a General Assembly's recognition that credit allowances and trading, those types of programs are out there. They exist. This is not a new or novel concept that hasn't been applied anywhere. In fact, in giving the commission the authority to do that, even to incentivize voluntary reductions, while I don't see that necessarily being what Reggie is. I mean, credits are not voluntary there, they're mandatory. It's just, that's the way it is. I still don't see that A12 provision narrowing or restricting the commission's ability to, in its judgment under A5, say credit trading is an appropriate part of the emission control standards program that we're allowed to establish. Now, reasonable minds can disagree, even unreasonable minds. But in either case, the answer is you likely do, because there's not been a case that says, yes, expressly you have this authority, or no, you do not. Given the very broad authority that this commission has, as well as the necessary implications of that authority, it appears to me that you likely do have that authority to include that. Now, that's the more specific question. The larger question that is before you today is whether you have the authority to do rulemaking in the first instance that would allow this rule to become effective. Again, you're not saying by a vote in favor of the petition, the grant petition, or the denial petition, you're not saying one way or the other that you actually will do that. But in considering whether you have the authority, and I heard this earlier, whether you have the authority to grant this petition, the answer clearly is yes, because you have the authority to engage in rulemaking. That is undisputed. It is expressed, is unquestionable. You have the authority to engage in rulemaking. Whether at the end of that you decide to adopt these rules is something different. Something different. So I do think you likely have the authority to adopt this or to adopt this, and I know you have the authority to proceed with rulemaking should you choose to do so.
Thank you, Council Reynolds. Well, my sworn today is without the committee, and because the full commission had voted on Commissioner Carter's motion that passed it, Commissioner Kerr's instinct on offer amendment at the committee level again. But you are over.
Well, I recognize this is the meeting of the committee, but my thought was if there was a willingness to go ahead and decide requesting a, certainly have a majority of the commission, maybe service meeting and so on, that's required. It shouldn't be. It couldn't be done if the group was inclined to do so. But as I said, I'm very operative. It doesn't look like it. There's, I guess, people.
Understood. Any other comments on either Commissioner Carter's statement or on the term?
Yeah, let's move away from the legal issue. What I did want to ask about it was something that was mentioned in the earlier presentations, and that has to do with the fiscal note. And I'm very curious about this because at least one point there was a statement that made it sound like we could go ahead in, or even in July, at the July meeting, if the commission chose to go forward without having a fiscal note in hand. And that didn't make any sense to me. So I want to make sure that we're all on the same wavelength on that. And I don't know if we could ask the director where they might be or what he thinks might be the timing or whatever we need to put together a fiscal note.
Yeah, absolutely. Dr. Representative, could you give us an update on where that stands? Assuming your microphone works. Yes.
Thank you, Chair Arata. Thank you, Chair Arata, and good morning, everyone. Lost track of time there. So thank you for the question, Commissioner Carter. So yes, and to kind of touch back on Commissioner Arata's comment earlier that she believed that the division and the department's not sitting idly by, that's true. We've been absolutely engaged in the review of this petition, not only for its completeness, but obviously to better understand the program. It's a very complex program. This is not your average petition, as you can tell from the discussion today. So we put some efforts into understanding it, engaging with Reggie Inc. and other participating Reggie states to understand the program and how it operates, and start looking ahead if the commission chose to grant the petition, what a fiscal note process might look like and what all that might undertake. I think we've identified that there's certainly a part of the fiscal note that we'll need help with, and that's related to the costs and the benefits and the rate impacts of the program. This is an area where the departments had discussions with the public staff of the Utilities Commission, and the public staffs indicated that they would have to do their own analysis to understand costs and rate impacts. To do so, they would request information from the affected facilities. That would likely take several months to collect that information from the affected facilities that are under the Utilities Commission's purview. So for DAQ to complete the fiscal analysis, we believe that we would need this public staff analysis. And again, they've agreed to conduct such an analysis if we get to that step in the rulemaking process.
I assume when you said public staff, I assume you're referring to the public staff at the Utilities Commission?
Yes, sir.
Good. Okay, good. I'm glad that's communicated.
Would it be a fair statement then that the fiscal note is in process what additional steps are needed before it can be presented to the commission.
Chair Arata, I think what I'd say is that we are scoping out what it would take to do and get a fiscal analysis approved by OSBM. And so discussions with OSBM have also occurred preliminarily, just to plan ahead in the event that the commission decides to grant the petition.
Okay. Thank you. This is perhaps a question for Chair Myberg for the July meeting. Obviously, we don't have that fiscal note today, so we would be making a recommendation to send the rulemaking petition presented forward. But what's your view of having that?
I think the answer really was the answer that Councilor Reynolds gave earlier. There's no requirement that you have a fiscal note to make the decision on whether to grant the petition. Fiscal note requirement applies to the rule. So I personally do not feel that you need that note. I think it's pretty clear, as Councilor Reynolds said, that we do not need to have a fiscal note to make a decision to grant the petition. And but we do have a specially called meeting on this scheduled for July 13th.
Let me just clarify, I was not suggesting we need a fiscal note for the serious petition, but I thought I was hearing a suggestion that we could in fact adopt a rule going forward on July 13th earlier. That's what.
No, I did not need to apply that.
No, I didn't catch it. I think you'd have almost every commissioner on your side saying that we do in fact need that to move forward legally and just based on logic or logical sense. Any other discussion? Commissioner Dewey.
Thank you. I just thought I would offer some remarks. Pretty much agree with what said by the chairman as far as I think the petition has followed the standard path for considering whether or not to hear a petition rule. I think we have to ask these questions with each and every petition. So I think the criteria that we'll make and whether or not to hear this appropriate. As for which body of government moves first, the executive versus the legislature, or within the executive, the utilities commission versus the or the environmental management commission. They all are options, but nobody has stepped forward. This is the first move to step forward if they take that action. I think in terms of study, there is no entity within government who is more prepared. A study board that under the leadership of the executive branch and DEQ has 2 years with the clean energy planning and all of the analyses that are associated with that. And I think the stakeholder participation has been extremely well demonstrated, and I think that is probably one of the motivations that led to the petition coming before us. So I think there is a sufficient body of evidence and information to support the petition. I think also that we have an opportunity here to take advantage of an established, well-performing system of RGGI that has monetary incentives to the state to help achieve our state's carbon reduction goals as effectively and efficiently as any system. There is no other system readily available to us, which I would say somewhat minimal impacts to household costs. And finally, Title IV, in my opinion, has always been an excellent model for the value and performance of the system. I think you've involved in that years ago. Acid rain was at its time probably comparable in importance to many people in this country as climate change is to us now. We didn't perceive climate change and carbon dioxide emissions having its impact, at least the majority of us did at that time. Title IV has performed well. Even starting back in 1990 when it began, we made dramatic changes quickly, but I, as a scientist, have seen over the past years that there are still very long-term repercussions from acid rain that's not going to that the pH in the water have improved. Ecosystems are still suffering. The soils are still bleaching, still have problems, only to say that if we don't begin to move quickly on this carbon dioxide issue, we're going to continue to see very long-term repercussions, no matter how fast we move at this point. Thank you.
So at this point, I think it would be good time to entertain a motion. If someone would like to offer a motion.
I move to hear the question of whether to move the petition on and approve it.
Well, sorry, Chair, ask, Mr. Monson, so restate that question. My motion, rather.
How would you like me to?
So, yeah, so is it are you suggesting that you're moving to that the committee recommend to the commission to grant the petition? Because either way, it goes to the full.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, Commissioner Deerhig seconds. Any further discussion? Okay. And some of us are remote. We're going to take a roll call vote once again. Commissioner Bailey,
I agree.
Commissioner Carter,
No.
Commissioner Davis,
Yes.
Commissioner Deerhig.
Yes.
No Commissioner Ozark and Commissioner Monis.
Yes.
The motion carries with a 4 vote.
I believe the chair has the discretion to vote in a case like this. Is that correct, Counselor?
We have an overwhelming majority in favor of it, but Chair Rada has that discretion. You have portion of your share, your position on the full volume.
Sorry, Commissioner Solomon not here, but I think to hear about giving the line is.
In other words, you don't have to vote, you don't want to, but I will make sure that we have the offer to everyone who is on.
I think I'll just leave it alone then, wait till the commission.
Far be it from me from being accused of abusing discretion. So I think that motion carries. I'll save my vote for the full commission meeting on July 13th. Well, briefly, Commissioner Mivers, do you have any other comments before we wrap things up?
I do not, other than I'm looking forward to seeing everybody in July and seeing you in person, since you seem to have pulled this off successfully. And I can see the light in Commissioner Carter's eyes about you. And I really was where Commissioner Carter was on this. As soon as we could actually do this and get together in person. Nobody wanted that more than me, and I'm delighted that that day has come. So, yay.
Okay. Council Reynolds, any additional comments?
Well, I think I said enough.
Thank you. Just thank you to all of our speakers who came out today and physically listened, and the staff are working diligently behind the scenes. And Council Reynolds, there's going to be more time than a 30 dishes on the family plate. So the next meeting of the Air Quality Committee is scheduled for July 7th. This meeting is adjourned.